I know lots of millionaires and billionaires and successful entrepreneurs, and none of them does what you do at all, right? So most successful entrepreneurs that build a startup and sell it either end up building another startup or end up buying a place in south of France and disappearing from the world. Nobody goes and builds a podcast and, writes a book and, shows up on shows and you're doing your tour now. Why? Why do you do how do you choose what next year for Stephen is going to look like?
So I think we all have tons of signals in our life and tons of forces which are sometimes conflicting, and they are acting as like a satellite navigation of where we should be going and what we should be doing. And some of those forces are external. Some of them are driven by insecurities, by social expectation. But one of those signals that we all have, all of us, is how we feel. It's a very simple signal. But it tends to be the case, as I've come to learn, that signal is like deprioritized. In the context of other signals, which is like social expectation, what my mother wants me to do, what society wants me to do to be considered a success. I think at some point, the signal of how I feel, maybe because of the absence of my parents, maybe because there was the other forces, the other signals, which are sometimes really, really strong in people, wasn't there. I've always, for some reason, I think it was because of the absence of my parents. I think they didn't put a lot of pressure on me because they were so busy, that signal tended to win out from a young age. So when I didn't like school, for example, I would just not go. And the consequences of that choice were not there. They were for my brothers and sisters. But by the time I was of age, by the time I was a young child, my parents' life dynamic had changed. So they were always working. So I'm this young kid at home who's literally waking up in the morning, my parents aren't there. Going to sleep at night, my parents aren't there. There's no money being left on the kitchen counter for packed lunches. There's no presents under the tree at Christmas. I had this like real immense freedom. So my feeling, how I felt every day became a really strong guiding principle or guiding signal. And that's kind of, I look at my life and I think that's continued. I went to university. I went for one day, didn't like it. People were asleep on the desks. They didn't want to learn business. I did. I never went back. My first startup, the same thing happened. The day that it became, I'd say a couple of weeks in a row, it became really unpleasant. And the signal in me was like, you don't like this anymore. I quit out the blue, even though I had investors in a team. Glass of wine, I quit. I then built a company that now has more than 1,000 employees, generating this year about 650 million in revenue. And during the pandemic, I was sat in Portugal and multiple weeks had passed in a row where I didn't enjoy it anymore. And I quit out the blue. 10 days before we were meant to go, we were booked to go on a fundraise to raise 40 million. I dropped out and I was the fundraiser and I quit. And they said, no, you can't. And I said, yeah, I can. And I quit. And so I think when I reflect on my life about the prism in which I've made my decisions, there's been this ongoing battle with insecurity, which was also present in my childhood. The only black kid in an all-white school. Our street, if you go on Google Maps and put in my address today, you will see this perfect street full of all white people. And then this one house in the middle, which is completely battered, which has the front window on my brother's bedroom, Jason, smashed for 15 years. The grass is at the front of the house about 3 or 4 feet high. At the back, it's about 6 or 8 feet high. The back of our house is knocked down. If you look in the conservatory, you'll see that it looks like a hoarder lives there. Because we lived like hoarders. Like there was some rooms in my house, at the back of my house, where you couldn't go in because they were packed to the ceiling with junk from Africa, So I lived and we attribute value of ourselves through the context in which we see ourselves. So the context in which I saw myself, as I talk about in the book, is I was the Nokia in a world full of iPhones. So I thought I was inferior. I grew up with that inferiority complex. So that was always a force in my life, which sometimes nearly risked me buying a Lamborghini to try and validate myself in the eyes of society. But generally the most powerful force is, how do I feel in the situation? And in the short term, that's a really dangerous signal to be guided by, it seems. But in the long term, being guided by how you feel is, I think, the path to fulfillment and outsized success. Because you end up doing things you really enjoy, then you end up becoming a master in those things. Then the world returns huge value for the fact that you became a master in something. And generally in my life, I'm like really happy, and I've never really understood why. But I think it's because I've been driven by that signal. So at 29 years old, I find myself living a life on my terms, being really financially free, having a wonderful relationship with a wonderful woman, and having constructed a life that I really love.